NASCAR team owner suspended indefinitely for substance abuse policy. One of these banned substances is allowed to sponsor a race car in NASCAR, and a look back at many other drivers and notable figures who went down this road, including one driver who took police on a high-speed police chase across 3 different states at over 150 miles an hour. Whew. I was driving my race car, and then I got high.
3, 2, 1.
What's up, everyone? Todd Brown, That Racist Show. Thanks for dropping by for this segment. Now, here we are, 1 week in the 2023 season, already getting headlines like this coming out. I said it was going to be a crazy year, and obviously it's going to get a little more wild than we thought. Now, news come down yesterday. Mr. Roper, busted on substance abuse. Not that one. There we go. Corey Roper, suspended indefinitely from NASCAR substance abuse policy, something we saw from so many drivers in the past. I figured this would be a good time to reflect on some of them things, maybe educate a few people who weren't familiar with stories of drivers this happened to, but just to overall take a look at this and see how it's impacted so many drivers in the past. Now, arguably, the very most notable name that this has happened to in the past is a guy that in 2009 failed a drug test and was eliminated from his car from the series at that point, and that was Jeremy Mayfield. Now, there was a lot to do with this whole story. There was news stories, local news stories, lawsuits, so many things, accusations that come out back and forth. And to Jeremy, now his clarification was that he was on a combination of Adderall and Claritin D at the time. NASCAR just seen whatever as being something they didn't want in the sport. And unfortunately for him, pretty much ended his Cup career. But I'm happy to say that Jeremy's still out there racing, still kicking ass in race cars and doing what racers do, because it just doesn't leave your system. Now, the drugs do, but not saying that's what happened to him. But that's the thing. There's so many things that stay in your system, so many things that cause these things to come up. That could be a simple use of a medication. And that brings me to this next guy right here, because this whole thing actually went back into the 80s, and there was a very notable name that this happened to in 1988. And this is a man who, to me, would have changed the stat books, not only for wins, but for championships, all through the end of the 80s into the 90s. And that is Tim Richmond. In 1988, had a failed drug test. Now, by his standards of what everything was, it was for excess use of ibuprofen and pseudoephedrine at the time. But there was a lot of drivers out there who had concerns about him using narcotics. I can remember actually Darrell Waltrip, Dale Earnhardt. There was different drivers that made comments and different commentary about this. A lot of drivers said he was under use of cocaine at the time. But unfortunately, it was a tragic ending to not only his career, but his life. And once again, man, I mean, that guy come back and won some races. And God, I just wish he'd have been able to continue racing, because I sure did love to watch him drive. Now, one guy here who I love to watch in his post-race interview got his first win in the Xfinity Series, and man, had a good time with it, evidently. And that is Spencer Gallagher. Now, in a Victory Lane interview, he had some very comical words, and let's take a listen.
Ryan, if you may, I'd like to take a second to personally address everyone at GMS. I know y'all are watching. That was every bit as crazy as it sounds. And when I get home, we are going to party like it's 1999, y'all. We won!
And evidently he did, because the very next day, suspended by NASCAR for substance abuse policy. And yeah, I don't find it funny, but I think back on one of the other things that he made highlight reels about, and that's this right here. And this was the official NASCAR Royal Rumble that went on that made headlines all across the place. But anyways, the other driver that was involved in this little scuffle right here is another guy who fell to this policy, and that was John West Townsley. And in 2012, he sustained a DUI off the racetrack, which partially affected his career. He eventually ended up stepping away from racing, but his life come to a tragic end as well. There was apparent reports he attacked his ex-girlfriend with a hatchet and was shot to death. And a sad ending completely for that young man's life and racing career. And it brings me to another guy who had another tragic ending, but was a very promising race car driver, and that was Kevin Grubb. Now, with Kevin in 2004, he had a failed drug test, did everything he needed to do to come back Got back in the car in 2006. After a race, he refused to take a drug test and was suspended once again from NASCAR. Now, in his defense, he said he was suffering from a concussion at that time, didn't even remember them asking him about taking a drug test. But ultimately, it led to a long road for him that ended with him taking his own life in 2009. And another sad ending that wish wouldn't have happened that way because, again, promising young drivers, but more than that, promising lives that were cut short, unfortunately. Now, there's another guy here who had another problem with the drug policies and went through his share of suspensions, and that was Shane Hamill. Now, Shane Hamill, that family is notable, notorious in NASCAR, with his dad as crew chief and so many other positions. And Shane, in 2003, was busted for marijuana use and suspended at that time. He did everything he needed to do to come back in 2005, where he was suspended for a second time, this time for marijuana and cocaine use, which ultimately ended his NASCAR career at that point. Shane did continue on, did a lot of sprint car racing, but suffered a tragic wreck in a sprint car that severe spinal injuries that has put him in a wheelchair the rest of his life, but he's still in racing, still involved. He's an inspiration for so many. And, just the whole effort of you can turn a bad story upside down and make something positive of it. So happy to see he's still out there and still racing, still doing things, not driving himself, but he's very much involved in the sport. Now, this brings me to a driver that I think a lot of people might have even forgot this happened to, but that is A.J. Allmendinger. That just don't even sound right to start with, because first of all, as hyped up as A.J. is, I couldn't imagine him if he was on some kind of substance, because that would be a wild thing in itself. But this was a situation where A.J. was in a workout with a partner, and the guy gave him an energy pill. Actually turned out to be Adderall, which is not on the condone list with NASCAR, but again, it cost AJ his career at that point, lost his ride with Penske, had to rebuild everything and come back. And obviously, AJ's out there kicking ass and winning races and the Cup. Really good in the Xfinity Series. And, another guy with a promising career that's still continuing on, rebuilding himself. And I think that's awesome. Now, we also got to talk about some people who weren't drivers. Actually, one of them was, but these are names that, again, notable NASCAR names that were part of this policy that things happened to them. Obviously, the biggest one is Brian France. He was busted in 2018 on a DWI charge, also had possession of controlled substance, and ultimately removed him from NASCAR at that point. And great episode with him, with Dale Jr. on the Dale Jr. download, where they got deep into this. And if you have not checked that out, you should. Tells a lot of the inside stories of it, and a really great episode. Now, a driver that went into other forms, various forms of things across NASCAR and different motorsports, it was busted smoking weed, hit a joint with some fans in the infield, and that was in 2010, and that was Randy LaJoie. Now, that's just two things I just don't see happening together, but it did happen. Once again, Randy was one to bounce back. Man is a legendary seat builder, legendary driver. I mean, former Busch champion, just a great family. So, something that doesn't define their name, just an incident that happened that was luckily in the past. Now, this brings me to one other driver or crew member who was a legendary name in NASCAR, and that was Todd Parrott. Now, Todd went through the same things. In 2013, he was failed on a drug test. Now, he's went through so many things after this, the road to recovery, did a lot of interviews, a lot of emotional interviews talking about what he went through with all this to come back. And if you've never checked them out, I encourage you to go watch some of them too, because some of these guys go through so many things, but they're human. They make mistakes. They come back and they bounce back, and doesn't define who they are, because they're great people outside of that. So encourage you, go check out some of these other things. Now, these next two drivers here are names that probably a lot of people might not be familiar with, but we're going to call these the big one, because these are some big crimes, big things that happen with these guys. Now, these did happen, incidents that happened off the racetrack, not NASCAR associated in general, but Aaron Fike in 2007 arrested in a parking lot, possession of heroin. Crazy little scenario with the police and that aspects that happened with it, and ultimately ended most of his career right there as far as NASCAR was associated with. And the crazy thing about this was he later come out in interviews and said that he was actually racing in NASCAR while under the influence of heroin. That's a scary thought to think about all the way around, and luckily nothing bad came from it. But saw some pictures of Aaron a few years back. Looked like he was healthy, living life, very fit. So hopefully he's out there living that good life and turned everything around. And final guy I want to bring up here. Now, this is another promising young driver who had a bad situation again in 2007. The driver for Bill Davis Racing, and that was Tyler Walker. Now, ultimately, again, ended most of his NASCAR career right here with this, but followed down a hard road for a little while after that. In 2013, was arrested after a high-speed chase of over 150 miles an hour through 3 states, including Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, before he was finally arrested. Had a slew of charges that came after that. Really haven't heard much about what's happened to him over the last several years or anything like that. So I just want to say, if anybody out there knows anything that's going on with either one of these guys, please throw some comments down there below, because I'd love to catch up and hear what they're doing these days, and hopefully everybody's out there living a good life and making the most of it. Now, the one thing I want to do just to wrap this up is something that I find really funny, is that we have a sponsor right now in NASCAR that if the drivers were to use the product that they're sponsored by, they would fail a drug test. Now, I'm not against all this stuff. Hey, everything that's coming in right now to the sport sponsorship-wise, I love. I think there's place for most things out there, and absolutely welcome different sponsors and different aspects into racing. But I just find it kind of a conflict of interest and very funny that the sponsor, if a driver used his own product he's sponsored by, would fail a drug test. Now, this is 3Chi. Now, if you're not familiar with 3Chi and anything to go along with this, they do sell a hemp-based gummy. That's a Delta 8 or a Delta 9, which has effects similar to marijuana gummies. And so I say I think it's funny, because the craziest part about it, Delta 8, Delta 9 will show up as a positive for marijuana on a drug test for most parts. And it's kind of wild to think that that's actually happening right now. But again, I'm not for or against either one of these things. I think it's great. Sponsors are in there. Got some pretty kick-ass little paint schemes on them cars too. And it's just wild, though, that they're at the racetrack and able to sell these products at the racetrack right now. But the products they're selling, NASCAR finds illegal for their drivers to take. So interesting that they are able to set up booths at the racetrack and sell this. But the product they sell, driver would be found in failure of a drug test if he took it. So interesting stories. But anyways, wow, here we are, just coming into the second week of the year, and all this stuff's coming out already. So once again, don't want to bash on anybody for anything that's happened with this. Just want to show you can take a bad thing and turn it into a positive. And hopefully so many of these guys did. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button, hit the likes. Got another episode coming this weekend. And as always, see you at Checkered Flag.